All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to go over another important misconception about psychic abilities, and that's this, what I basically put right here, which is that psychic abilities are safe to use, right? So, like I said, this is going to be mostly recap, but I just want to basically go over it again because this is important, right? And when I wrote this section in the book, I mainly had New Agers in mind, so I kind of already spoke about them a lot in the last chapter. But again, I want to make this very clear, right? So a lot of this is stuff, these are things that I've heard, right, in the sort of psychic community when I've seen this stuff online, right? Because once I knew how to use this stuff, sometimes I would just be curious to say, like, what do other people say about this stuff, right? Sometimes I'd be curious to see if their ideas about how this stuff work, if it matches my theory on how it works, right? These abilities and these phenomena. And these would be a lot of the things I'd hear when I hear people talking about this stuff, right? Not in parapsychology, which those would be more or less the scientists who study this stuff. These are like just kind of people online, usually teenagers or young people, right? But they'll say things like this. They'll say psychic abilities are natural to use, right? So they'll say, oh, these are natural abilities that God gave you, right? And so it's okay to use them. Don't let people tell you that using your psychic abilities are wrong. Or they'll say any negative experience you have is just your subconscious working itself out, right? I've heard that so many times, right? Because people, when they use psychic abilities, they inevitably start having demonic experiences, right? It happens. It's like basically what I said, inevitable, right? It's almost going to happen, a guarantee, right? That you're going to have some type of negative demonic experience. And so they will say, oh, that's your subconscious working itself. That is just amazing that so many lengths these people will go to sort of make it so that psychic abilities aren't evil, right? They're using them isn't wrong, I should say, when you use them in a certain way. But they'll have these dark experiences, and they'll say that's your subconscious mind. Your subconscious mind created that negative entity. It created that dark experience because you have unhealed trauma. First of all, so if you accept my claims, right, I know how the subconscious works, and it definitely doesn't work like that, right? That's just, I don't know where that nonsense comes from about this unhealed trauma in your subconscious, right? Can you have certain unhealed experiences that you haven't fully healed from? Of course, right? So that particular section of your subconscious, first of all, it would only be volatile for a relatively short time, right? And then the energy would be lost in terms of your long-term memory, right? Is it possible to sort of have an experience for an experience that happened years ago to sort of cause you to react very, very emotionally and intensely? I don't know, right? To be fair, I haven't really had that, to be honest. I know some people may portray that type of behavior. I don't think so, right? I just think in those moments, they focus on the experience and they shock charge it so it charges very quickly. However, it still doesn't really charge that intensely, right? That's not a thing, right? But anyway, going back to this, right? That's definitely not how the subconscious works as it relates to psychic abilities, right? So a lot of times these New Agers will always come up with some type of, I want to be kind of kind and not say nonsense, right? Because they're not like the scientists who would say they're practicing science, but they're really not, right? A lot of these are young people who really just don't know any better, right? They're kind of hearing what a lot of other young people have told them, and those young people have usually gotten this information from their spirit guides, right? Who give them all types of commands and put them on all types of missions to go talk to these people and those people and things like that. Tell them about this pagan god or some nonsense like that, right? So that's where a lot of those ideas come from in this community, right? But ultimately, right? No, psychic abilities are very, very dangerous. It does not matter that they are natural, right? Emotions are natural, right? But lust still pushes you away from God, right? It does not matter that it's a emotion that God gave you, and so you can do it as much as you want to, right? That's one of those satanic sort of beliefs where there's always this idea. There's always, in Satanism, the satanic philosophy is always about sort of putting the focus mostly on yourself, right? Doesn't even have to be Satan or some pagan god, right? It's usually about putting the focus on yourself and putting yourself above God. and labeling it liberation or something like that, right? Giving you the freedom to engage in some kind of sin and labeling it liberation or freedom. So we talked about that, I think it was the last chapter. So it's the exact same thing that happens in New Age and when they talk about psychic abilities in New Age, right? You have the freedom to use psychic abilities however you feel like, right? And you have the freedom to do it because it's a gift God gave you, right? It's an ability he gave you. Why wouldn't he want you to use it however you felt like? Who cares if it destroys you? Well, I shouldn't say destroy the planet, right? So we can go further. Yes, psychic abilities can be very dangerous in that way. And that happens in the occult and that using psychic abilities on that scale are very different. Most young people don't go that far with it. Using it on the scale that is very dangerous to the entire society, right, entire country. Usually it's used on that scale, at least I believe, in the occult, right, and in the witchcraft covens who go very far, and they talk to very high-ranking fallen angel, or very high-ranking demonic entities, which would be, I just call them fallen angels, right? Those are the ones that God showed me. But those are the ones who talk with them, and they plan with them, and things like that, right? So most young people don't take it anywhere near that far. They don't go anywhere near that far with it, but still, even those people, I think, by that time, they know that they're engaged in evil, right? They just feel loyal to it for some reason, right? And I've read these experiences about some people who have gone very far with psychic abilities, and for whatever because Satan gives them things, they feel this loyalty to him, right? So it's exactly like I said, it's the moral reversal, basically, right? Satan uses their goodness against them, right? So because they think it's good to be loyal to someone who has been good to you, right? They don't recognize that Satan's not good to them. He's trying to separate them from goodness, which is God, right? But still, people who go that far up, like I said, I'm pretty sure they know they're engaging in evil at that point, right? They just feel for some reason they have to be loyal to this person who gave them a whole bunch of worldly treasures, right? But not spiritual treasure, which God gives you. But anyway, so basically, just to I think I've gone over it enough, but basically, no, psychic abilities are very dangerous. It does not matter how natural they are or whatever sort of nonsense that some people want to come up with, right? Because psychic abilities, like anything else, they have rules, right? I have the ability to steal, right? I have the ability to choose to steal. That is a natural gift God gave me, the gift of choosing. That does not mean that anything I choose is aligned with the will of God. Psychic abilities are the same way, right? You have the ability to use psychic abilities, yes. That does not mean any way you use them is aligned with God's will, right? If you use them in a way that is not aligned with his will, that is sinning, right? That is pushing spiritual energy away, right? In fact, I forgot to even mention it. When I use, like I said, I don't have experience yet, right? At this point in my life, as of the recording of this video, maybe I'll do it in the future, or I'll pray to God and see how he wants me to do it in the future, because I think he's already given me a message is that he does kind of want me to start getting more into psychic abilities, but it's definitely not going to be in the way I used to use them, right? So I have to speak to God about that, but I haven't done that yet. But as of now, I haven't used psychic abilities in a positive way. However, when I used to use them, which was years ago from this recording, is I would, every time I would charge psychic energy or psychic abilities, we'll talk about psychic energy in the next chapter, every time I would charge my subconscious to use psychic abilities, I would always feel extremely depressed, right? So I would feel more, and the more I charged them, because like I said, I didn't even really know about charging that much back then, right around the time I stopped using psychic abilities, just because I started getting better at them, is when I started to recognize that they deep charged, right? Again, I didn't call it that back then, didn't fully have the idea of deep charging just yet, but that's when I first started to get an inkling that deep charging was even a thing, and that your subconscious performs better relative to whatever you want it to do if you charge day after day after day, right? So I didn't do that with psychic abilities back then, but I started to. But as I started to charge psychic abilities more and practice them day after day after day, I would get more and more and more and more depressed, right? Now, like I said before, I'm not really a depressed type of person. I just don't have that type of personality. Never really did, right? My whole life, very few times in my life would I ever say I was in a state of depression, right? And I've had a million reasons to be depressed, right? But that just wasn't me. That's not my personality. Like I think I mentioned it before, when I first started using psychic abilities, because I knew how to charge emotions, right? So my emotional energy was usually pretty high, right? But when I started practicing psychic abilities, I started noticing that I had to sort of it's like I had to give in to this feeling of depression, right? Because when I would always try to enter a transcendental state, right? Like I said, I didn't call it that back then, but actually it's funny, I called it a different name then. But I would enter transcendental state and try to use it to sense some target, basically, psychically, right? Again, I'll talk more about that in the next chapter, but how that works. But I would do that, and, it would be very difficult at first, but as I kept doing it, it's like I felt this pressure, right? Where it's like if you're trying to make a joke, right? You'll feel a kind of pressure as your subconscious charges or organizes, right, to help you in your terms of your transcendental creativity to tell a joke. You'll feel a kind of pressure in terms of your compulsion on how to say something, how to move your body as you say it, right? That's your delivery. How to organize or structure your words in the form of a setup and punchline. You'll feel that pressure in your mind if you just hold the intention to tell a joke, right? And that pressure will grow and grow and grow as your subconscious charges, which represents part of that is organization. And so that similarly is what I felt when I would charge psychic energy. When I charge psychic abilities. Whenever I charge it, I would feel like this pressure to lean in more to that feeling of depression, right? Which is a horrible thing, right? But I kept feeling that, right? I kept feeling that if I go deeper into the depression, right, then that helps me to do with what my intention is asking for, which is to sense something psychically, right? And like I said, because I'm not really used to depression, as I would do it more and more, and I noticed it, I'm like, why do I feel so depressed, right? And I'm not used to depression, so I didn't really know that was depression, right? But I would feel like just the absence of emotion. I would just feel like I couldn't feel anything. And I didn't know about the subconscious short-term memory, had no idea about any of that at the time. So I kept thinking that I could just do this and then go back to what I was doing and feel all this emotion and things like that. No, I didn't know that your subconscious is like a battery and it stores energy, and that energy will weigh your future subconscious expressions down, or how your subconscious expresses, or some subconscious action, right? It'll basically weigh your emotions down later, depending on how your subconscious is charged, right? So we talked about that in book 1. It could boost an emotion or dampen it, which I didn't know any of that at the time. And so as I kept charging subconscious energy to use psychic abilities more, I would just feel more and more depressed, and I hated that feeling. And by the way, what I would do, which is also terrible, right? I would try to do things to shock myself to feel more emotion. Now, I probably shouldn't say this. This is probably a little embarrassing. But what I used to do is I would watch adult titles, right? So I'm just going to put that out there, because I want to give my testimony to people so they don't make the mistakes I did, right? Because I would watch adult titles to try to shock myself, because that comes from your body, right? Your body sends a command to your subconscious. And so it'll shock me into feeling some type of emotion. The only problem with that emotion is that it is sinful, right? Which is why I started having so many dark, demonic experiences. So that just makes it worse, right? But I didn't know that at the time. And so suffice it to say that the way I was using psychic abilities was fundamentally antithetical to spiritual energy, right? So, which is how sin, basically any sin is, right? When you engage in sin, it pushes spiritual energy away, right? Now, I don't think necessarily everything that is antithetical to spiritual energy is necessarily sinful. I think it is possible to produce negative emotions and really do a lot of it without it being sinful, right? Pushing spiritual energy away. It'll dampen spiritual energy and you're not charging it while you're having these negative thoughts, but I don't think it's sinful. And the one exception I think I mentioned before is like depression. It's when you kind of have low self-esteem. I don't know, something about that feels different. Because I don't have those thoughts very often, but I feel like when I have had those thoughts and sort of attacked myself, it didn't feel like sinful. It didn't feel like when I'm watching adult titles or when I cuss, right? Or when I, lie. To do things that or cheat. Well, I rarely ever do those things, but if I have like an intention, or a thought that I could do this, it feels I'm wrong immediately, right? But it doesn't really feel like that if I have a thought of attacking myself and things like that. So I think that's an exception, but suffice it to say, psychic abilities are definitely sinful. Like, they push spiritual energy away directly. At least if you use them in a certain way, right? And the way I was using them was a negative way, right? So that's important to understand here, right? When you use psychic abilities in a way that is not approved by God, basically, you're going to push spiritual energy away. As you push spiritual energy away, you're going to, basically, as you use psychic abilities more and more in that way, you lose more and more spiritual energy. You're going to get more and more depressed. Now, you might say, well, you can also, when you're in a state of low spiritual energy, it could also be the case that you feel a large amount of negative emotion, right? So we talked about that with emotional possession. In my experience, that is not what happened to me. When I was never psychically possessed. I would say I had a subconscious infection, right, from using my psychic abilities in a negative way. However, I didn't feel a lot of negative emotion, right? I just felt depressed. Like, I felt super depressed. Like, I couldn't feel any emotion. So I think that's how it is when you use psychic abilities in the negative way. Or when you become psychically possessed, you just feel depressed, right? You don't feel a huge amount of negative emotions, here and there. When you're emotionally possessed, then you feel a huge amount of negative emotion, right? It's very intense. So that's my experience. What I want to get at here, so this is a graph of a cubic function, or x cubed. I probably should put that. Not that it's that important, but can't really see that. Let me, yeah. So again, that's not super important, but I kind of think of this graph when I think of the nature of psychic abilities. So what I want to talk about now is kind of what happens when you start using psychic abilities in the negative way and in the positive way, or my theory on using it in the positive way, because I've never done that before. So, when you use, some people, I've heard this in New Age, right? I've actually heard this from people who have gone away from New Age, actually. So these are in the New Age to Jesus testimonies. So this is something that they say, which I actually don't think is true, right? So they'll say that they had all these psychic powers when they were very deep into New Age and very deep into psychic possession and talking to their spirit guides and this and that. And then they say when they left all that stuff, all their psychic abilities went away, basically when they turned to Jesus, right? And they would say that psychic abilities, that we don't have psychic powers at all, or psychic abilities at all, and all those abilities solely came from demonic entities. I actually don't think that's true, right? That's just not really how they work. We all have psychic abilities, right? And they're toned down because they need to be for what we basically the purpose of life. That's the natural order. Some people are born with them turned on, right? Either has a generational curse, so we talked about that, or because it's their purpose from God, right? So it has to be on so they could carry out their purpose. But generally, for most people, their psychic abilities are in a turned off state, right? A lot of times in near-death experiences, their third eye or their psychic abilities are turned back on, right? And so they just know a large amount of information instantaneously. That ability is in your spirit, right? That's not necessarily ability that just comes from, you gaining some new ability when you're in a near-death experience or in an out-of-body experience, right? That's actually innate to your spirit. However, this is what I believe really happens, right? You do have the ability to use psychic abilities on your own without demonic entities. Just like you can feel emotions without some negative entity making you can feel a negative emotion without a negative entity forcing you to feel more, right? Is the same thing with psychic abilities. You can use them, but negative entities will sort of enhance them. So that's what's going on there that they're not realizing. So what I'm getting at here is, let's say I start using psychic abilities, right? I start charging my subconscious to use a psychic ability. Well, I can charge my subconscious more and more and more and more, and I'll be able to use that psychic ability in a more and more and more sort of effective way, which we'll talk about more of that in chapter 7. So we'll talk about what happens when you charge your psychic abilities more. But suffice it to say, your psychic abilities will increase as you charge psychic energy more, or psychic abilities more. So let's say that I'm starting off right here in the middle with a zero, we'll just say a zero charge, right? I'm not using units, right? So you can imagine just use made up units. But let's say your charge is at 0, right? Let's even use a percentage. No need to use a percentage. Let's just say you have a 0 charge of psychic abilities at the moment. If you charge them in a way not approved by God, then you're going to go in this negative direction, right? And as you charge it more and more and more, your psychic abilities will increase. So let's say I want to use them for ESP. So I want to use them to see a hidden target. If I charge it more and more, my accuracy is going to increase. However, my spiritual energy is dropping, right? So let's even say that, let's just say that this graph is spiritual energy, right? And this represents the increase in psychic energy. Now you could see that, or this axis, not that it matters too much. I mean, you could use both of them, but you can see that as you increase in spiritual energy, in this case, as you increase in your psychic abilities, you lose spiritual energy. As you lose spiritual energy, what's going to happen? You're in this low spiritual energy state, a negative entity is going to latch onto you at some point. Now, when they latch onto you, what they can do at that point is enhance your psychic abilities. So that's important. And when they enhance your psychic abilities, now you can use them in a much more sort of intense way that you couldn't at the beginning. So it wasn't necessarily that you couldn't use psychic abilities at all. It was just an eventual truth or a natural inevitability that if you were using them in a way that was not approved by God, you were at some point going to get an infection in your subconscious by a negative entity, and because that negative entity loves the idea that you're using psychic abilities in this way, they're going to enhance your psychic abilities. So now you notice you got more, it's going to feel like you got more power, right? Now again, this is fake power. Real power comes from the Holy Spirit. Fake power is all the parlor tricks that negative entities and Satan like to use because they know that we are interested in those things, which those are all nonsense. Right? It means nothing that you can use these little fake tricks. Who cares, right? It's nonsense to be able to use a psychic ability to read someone's mind or to sort of see what's behind door number 2 or to look slightly ahead into the future. We'll talk more about how the future works. We have to talk about how time works, which we'll talk about that probably in chapter 9. I could talk about it next chapter, but I'd rather talk about it based on what we talk about chapter 9. But if you try to look into the future, right? If you're using all these things to gain some type of advantage in the world or get ahead or get money or have people sort of idolize you, things like that, basically it goes back to this idea that these things are cool, right? Satan is going to use that to just separate you from God, right? None of that stuff means anything. I guarantee you, right, if you do that stuff, when you pass from this world, you're not going to be able to use those abilities and they won't save you or protect you, right? It's completely fake power. I've seen it happen where I even had this dream. Well, I told you guys about one of my dreams where I would say Jesus' name to this negative entity and boom, gone, right? So these same entities that help you do this, they're nothing compared to Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit. Like you know what I mean? Whose team do you want to be on? The one who has real power or the ones on the team of people who run from the people who have real power? And I believe I had another dream. There was a dream one day I had where I think I felt the presence of Satan in this dream, right? And then I saw Jesus. It was kind of like, it's hard to describe the setting. It was like a setting on the outside. It was like a setting outside or outdoors, like in a town almost. But I saw Jesus. He was like on top of this sort of building. Not like a big building, but almost like a house. Not quite a house either. It's hard to describe it, but it's like I'm closer to a house than a building. He was like on top of this building. He had like all white and like gold. It's like amazing. Like you never get used to Jesus. Like he's so amazing. His presence is so incredible. But I saw him and then Satan ran, right? I felt the presence was gone. Like if just run away, right? And so that's what happens. Like all that witchcraft and all that fake power you get from them, it's nothing, right? It means it's absolute garbage. Like I said, real power comes from God, right? In the Holy Spirit. Just because they don't use that power for the sort of fake parlor tricks that demonic entities use it for, doesn't mean that it's not there, right? That's that's true power. So I just wanted to make that distinction. But when you use psychic abilities in a negative way, as you use it more and more, a negative entity will latch onto you and enhance them, right? So you're always going to notice kind of a increase in your psychic abilities. And I really should have changed this graph, because at this point, once you get a subconscious infection, you're going to notice a sort of drop off much steeper, right, than normal. Now, when you use psychic abilities in the positive way, that's when you're using them in a way charged that's being helped by spiritual energy. And that's, I believe, so this is my theory, I believe God's Spirit or the Holy Spirit will help you to do that, and your abilities will increase, right? And so these are people who, I've read experiences from people who have had an experience with God, and an experience, in a near-death experience, and then when they came out of it, they had these abilities. They had these psychic abilities which they could use, right? Or these abilities of perception. Some of them had the ability to heal others, things like that. So when you do it in the positive way, so this is just a theory, because I've never done it before, but when you use them in a positive way, God will help you. The Holy Spirit will help you, right? And you will use, I don't even know that you would really call it psychic abilities at that point. It's really just the power of the Holy Spirit, right? So the Holy Spirit gives you power, and it helps you to carry out the will of God, right? Here, when you use it in the negative way, negative entities latch onto you, and they will just enhance your power. So I just thought that was an important distinction to make. There's really no way to avoid it. At some point, it's just like if I charge lust, or if I charge hate or anger, right? At some point, a negative entity is going to latch on to me. There's no way for me to, it's not going to be the case that I just reached these really high levels of anger, but a negative entity just ignored me and let me just keep going. No, they're going to at some point latch on to you and enhance that ability, right? So if it's lust, I'm going to eventually get infected by a lust demon, and they're going to enhance my lust more and more and more and more, so much more than it would have been had I just been charging it on my own. And the same thing happens with psychic abilities. So by the way, that's also true of your chi energy. So we haven't talked about that yet in that much detail. We'll talk more about that in chapter 8, but I believe that's true as well. Like, a lot of people get into this idea of chi, right, and using their chi, and they think it's cool. Sometimes they approach it from the perspective of yoga. And again, they think it's cool and it's fun to use. It is fun to manipulate your chi and things like that. Now, most people don't know how to, so they don't really go anywhere with it. They just kind of talk about it, but they don't really do much of anything with it, right? It's just this sort of intellectual sort of exercise. Some people, however, actually successfully learn how to control their chi, and they use it in a more supernatural way. And I believe if you use it in a supernatural way, right, in a way that's not aligned with the Spirit of God. So I believe some people use it for telekinesis in that way. I'll talk more about that later. I know a lot of people think telekinesis isn't real. I think it's real because I've done it before, which, like I said, I'll talk about that later. But when you use it in that way, that's a negative way. And so a negative entity will latch on to you, and they can enhance your ability to use telekinesis. I've even read about people who have been able to heal others, or it seemed like they healed others, right? I don't think they were actually healed, not in the way the Holy Spirit heals people. But their abilities were enhanced by negative entities. So basically, that's just important to I thought that was important enough to say here, right? When you use psychic abilities, you will be able to sort of do psychic stuff. Or when you charge your subconscious for psychic abilities, you will be able to do psychic stuff. But as you charge it more and more, you're not really going to be able to get to the higher levels of using it without a negative entity latching onto you when you use it for evil or in a way not approved by God. And then they're going to be completely enhanced. So that's just why you see a lot of witches and people in the occult. They want more and more. Sometimes I've heard about these experiences from testimony that I saw, right, where they will want more negative entities to latch onto them because they want more power, right? The negative entities can influence their subconscious to help them to use more psychic power or use their psychic abilities at a higher degree of charge. Again, it's more fake power. It's more, they want more of something they can see. They want to feel more powerful and above others, and like they have more control over their life. And ultimately what it is just putting yourself in the position that God should be in, right? God is all truth and God is all love. You should defer to Him for everything going on in your life, and you should want to defer to Him and trust in Him for everything going on in your life. Not even really yourself, because you don't have all truth. But Satanism tries to get people to do it that way, to put focus on yourself and call it liberation or freedom or some garbage like that. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I just wanted to talk about that. I thought that was important. The next thing I want to talk about, is an experience I had that I would call psychic headaches, right? So when I used to use psychic abilities a lot, when I used to use psychic abilities a lot, I would experience this feeling, right? I would experience this phenomena that I haven't really heard from other people, but this used to happen to me all the time. I would get something that I call a psychic headache. So when I used to practice psychic abilities a lot, I would constantly, before I even go into that, when I first practiced psychic abilities, right, the very first day I decided, like, I'm going to practice psychic abilities, I'm going to figure out how this stuff works. I remember it, right? I would get this feeling right in my pineal gland, right exactly almost in the center of my forehead. And the pineal gland is something you hear about a lot when it comes to psychic abilities, right? So you hear about how the pineal gland is some people call it I've read it before, that's called the window to the soul, or it's highly associated with psychic abilities or the spirit or something like that, right? And a lot of science will say, oh, that doesn't make any sense. The pineal gland is just a normal gland or a normal organ. I don't know if they call it an organ, but a normal gland in the brain and things like that. And in my experience, as usual is the case with science, the orthodox science, that's completely wrong, right? There is definitely a connection between the pineal gland and your spirit, right? Really your third eye. Because the first day I started using psychic abilities, I would feel pressure building up in my pineal gland immediately. That's another thing about in New Age when they say you have to open your third eye, and that's not really how it works, right? Most people just don't use their third eye, and that's by design, right? But if you start using your psychic abilities, the second you start using them, boom, your third eye starts to activate, it starts to charge up, right? But more specifically, I talk about it more in terms of the pineal gland, right? So your pineal gland just starts to become active, right? And I would feel it, and I wouldn't, that first day where I felt it, I thought it was interesting. I didn't really know what to make of it, but I was like, that's interesting, right? Because I remember reading about that. But as I started to practice psychic abilities more and more and more, I would feel that sort of throbbing feeling in my, it's like a pulsing feeling in my pineal gland or in the center of my forehead. I would feel it, but I would feel it as I practiced psychic abilities more and more and more, that feeling would get more and more intense and eventually would start to hurt, right? And then eventually, as I continued to practice psychic abilities, it would start to hurt like crazy, right? I remember one day it hurt so much that I thought I was giving myself brain damage, right? Like, because it was so bad. But the reason I kept practicing is because I wanted to know how psychic abilities worked, right? I didn't know that they were evil at the time, right? I didn't know that I was using them. I didn't know that I was using them in a negative way at the time, right? All these symptoms were there. It should have been obvious, but I just didn't put it together yet. Again, this was all new to me. And so when I would practice using psychic abilities, even though I had a headache, I would keep trying to practice to sort of figure out how they work and make sense of it and things like that and come up with more theory, right? But eventually I had to stop and slow down because it just hurt too much, right? Like I said, I thought maybe I was giving myself brain damage. That's how much it hurt. There were days where it hurt that much. But ultimately, when you use psychic... So I don't know if this is for everybody, right? This is just me, right? When I would use psychic abilities, I would get what I call psychic headaches, right? So psychic headache is basically... Actually, I don't even think I read this yet, but psychic headaches are headaches that occur in the pineal gland area as a result of using psychic abilities. So in other words, I would have a headache right in the area where my pineal gland is supposed to be. I would start feeling almost like this pounding feeling. And as I was using my psychic abilities more, that pounding feeling would grow stronger and stronger, which I would just experience as a headache, a specific type of headache. And I remember when it was first happening, I would try to take aspirin for it. Did absolutely nothing, right? I've never even experienced that before. Didn't matter how much aspirin I took, made absolutely no difference. It still hurt, right? It just didn't really change anything about it. The headache only went away when I stopped practicing psychic abilities, when I would take a break from it or just turn away from it altogether. So this is something that I think is important, right? It's important to recognize, especially if, I didn't have, as far as I know, I didn't have any permanent damage from this, right? One thing I will say is that, and I think I put this in the book, I used to, when I would use these abilities, right, I noticed that it was harder for me to sleep with, even like in the darkness. I would turn the light off and go to sleep, but it was like it was still too light for me. It was too bright. I had to start putting like a cloth over my eyes so it'd be darker. And some people do that, right? But I never did it before this, right? And after this, I had to do that, right? It just feels too light when I sleep without something else covering my eyelids. But other than that, as far as I know, thankfully, I didn't have any permanent brain damage. However, some people might, right? Some people might be more vulnerable to some type of damage in their brain from using this, right? So I don't know what causes this or why it happens. I can only say from personal experience, right? I had very intense headaches when I was using my psychic abilities in this way. One theory that I did have, though, and I could be wrong about this, so I haven't really looked it up that much yet, but one thing I think happens is I get the sense, when it was occurring, I get the sense that blood is rushing to my pineal gland, right? So I think blood is rushing to my pineal gland when I use psychic abilities, and that the volume of the pineal gland expands because blood is rushing in. Now, most people don't use psychic abilities, so that never really happens to most people. But when you're using psychic abilities, blood rushes to the pineal gland, so it becomes more active, then it expands. Now, here's the thing. You have a calcium sort of wall, I believe, around the pineal gland, and it's not really that consequential most of the time. I mean, your pineal gland just kind of shrivels up and dies as you get older. It's very active and very healthy and large for us, right, as you're a kid or I think a teenager. But then as you get older and older into adulthood, it just kind of shrivels up and kind of dies. But if you're using psychic abilities, then it expands. And that calcium wall that's around it, it sort of expands into that calcium wall. So this is my theory, right? And so when you keep using psychic abilities, so I think we talked about it before, I think in chapter 6, right, in book 1, when you keep charging your subconscious in a certain way, your brain will actually enlarge. A certain section of your brain will enlarge to reflect that behavior, that activity, right, and make it easier for you to perform it. Now, I think that when you use psychic abilities, your pineal gland enlarges, right? It gets bigger over time as you keep using them. And as it grows larger and larger, it doesn't have room because the calcium wall is there. So it just pushes up against the wall more and more and more as it's trying to grow. And that's what causes a headache. So that's my theory on it, right? And so that's why I think I was getting these intense headaches, right? And it was just so bad. But like I said, I kept pushing through it because I wanted to know how this stuff works. But eventually I did just stop. I had to slow down. I stopped really because God told me to stop. But ultimately I slowed down with them. I just couldn't study them the way I really wanted to. Because like I said, using your psychic abilities to sort of get information about target is a very long process. It's not a 1, 2, 3 process, right? So because it was so long, I had to just endure these headaches for a long period of time. And then it was just too much work and I just couldn't. It was too much it was too difficult because of the pain of the headache, right? It was too distracting. And I just couldn't study them the way I really wanted to. But ultimately, I think those headaches might have came from a pineal gland pushing up against the calcium wall. But like I said, this could be very dangerous for some people. And so, it's important to recognize this, if you're trying to use psychic abilities or charge them. So the last thing I want to talk about is what I call psychic insomnia, right? So just to read it off, this one should be pretty quick. Psychic insomnia is insomnia that results from using psychic abilities. So this was another thing I noticed happened to me. When I would use psychic abilities, I noticed I just had much more trouble sleeping. It was very hard for me to just drift off to sleep, right? It was like I would just stay awake. And what actually ends up happening is your pineal gland is very central to falling asleep, so that's something I learned. However, something happens with it when you're using psychic abilities. It feels almost to me like it's becoming too active. It's becoming more active than it's supposed to be, right? I don't know. That's just what it feels like. And when you're trying to fall asleep, I I don't know. It's hard to explain it, but it feels like the activity of your pineal gland is supposed to go down or supposed to go to a certain level. But when it's too active, it's just hard for you to fall asleep. That's what it felt like for me. And so whenever I would try to fall asleep, it was just hard to fall. Eventually I would fall asleep, but it's very difficult to fall asleep and stay asleep, right? So I would have insomnia. Then when all that energy from using psychic abilities would discharge, I could sleep just fine, right? So, but it took a couple of days. But then when I would charge the psychic energy again, then I would notice that the insomnia is coming back again, right? So that's always how it was when I use these abilities. Always had insomnia. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that. So these are some of the dangers of using psychic abilities, right? There are probably others, right? I haven't studied psychic abilities that much. I've just pretty much learned, I believe, how they work, but I haven't gone very far with them. The only way I'm probably willing to do it is in the positive case, right? Which is in alignment with the will of God, but I haven't done that yet. But yeah, so these are the negative experiences that I have had, right? Like I said, there may be others. And so it's important to recognize that psychic abilities are not safe to use. They're very dangerous. And you could be psychically possessed, especially using them against the will of God. You're damaging your spirit, which is really the most important thing, right? And but there are these other these other problems with it as well, right? So yeah, again, you shouldn't really be anywhere near psychic abilities unless you have permission from God. And if you don't have a strong relationship with God, then you shouldn't even think about psychic abilities, right? And again, like I said before, there is no. If you're interested in using psychic abilities, ask God what He wants you to use them for, right? I don't really think there's any like one size fits all type of way you can use psychic abilities. Like a moral behavior is one size fits all. Everyone knows that sort of giving to the poor is a moral behavior, right? It doesn't. There are some sort of exceptions to that, but for the most part, if your intention is pure in giving to someone who's poor, right, that's a moral behavior. I don't know that there's any way to use psychic abilities that everyone can just do and it's good, right? No, you need permission from God and direction from Him. If you don't have that, just consider whatever you're doing to be against the will of God, right, which is evil. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the chapter. I don't really feel the need. In the book, I also talk about positive aspects or some benefits of using psychic abilities, but I don't really think it's necessary to go into that. Like I said, the dangers just outweigh the benefits too much. It's not worth it. Right? Like I said, you only use them if God has asked you to use them. And He's directed you to how to use them if you ask Him. But yeah, that's it for this chapter. So in the next chapter, we're going to talk about how to actually use psychic abilities. We're going to set up the theory on how to use them. But yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.